So today we will be looking at the gift of boundaries in our session. We talked about, gospel-based parenting in the first session. So we examined that narrative, grand narrative of scripture about creation, fall, redemption, and new creation. And we talked about how to give our teenagers a worldview that can withstand the crushing pressures of a secular digital age. And today we are going to take that massive, beautiful theology of grace and figure out exactly how it works in your living room on a Tuesday night or Thursday night or Friday night when your teenager refuses to put their phone away, rolls their eyes at you, or breaks their curfew. Today we are talking about boundaries. Let's be honest. In many of our Indian households, boundaries is a dirty word actually. It's not a real good word. It sounds terribly American, doesn't it? It sounds rebellious. In our cultural context, families are supposed to be completely enmeshed. So we do everything together. We know everybody's business and we share everything. If an Indian teenager walks up to their parent and says, "Mom, Dad, I need you to respect my boundaries," immediate cultural reflex is absolute panic. We think, boundaries? What do you mean boundaries? I gave you birth, I paid for your tuition, I sacrificed my life for you, and now you want to put up a wall to keep me out? In our minds, a boundary is an act of hostility. It feels like a rejection of our love and a rejection of the family unit. But I wanted to radically shift your perspective today. By the end of the session, my goal is for you to see that setting boundaries is not an act of hostility. It is a profound act of love. You will learn how to set boundaries that protect your own peace of mind, preserve your relationship with your teenager, and perfectly reflect the grace of God. So we are calling this session the gift of boundaries because a boundary is one of the most loving, stabilizing, and spiritually forming gifts you can ever give to a developing human soul. We are going to divide this topic into two parts. In the first half, we are going to look at the architecture of grace, the theology and neurobiology of why boundaries exist. In our next half, we will look at the application of grace, the exact clinical scripts and practices you can use to enforce these boundaries without destroying your relationship. Let's begin by laying the foundation with the architecture of grace. But before I go, I have a couple of slides. So who can tell who is a teenager? A teenager, a phenomenon where the child turns their teen and causes the parents to age 10 years overnight. What is an adolescence? That magical stage where the child believes they have added all the sense in the world and suddenly the parents know absolutely nothing. That's how they feel. So we'll come to the architecture of grace. What is a boundary? Let me define this boundary with two different lenses. One, I will try to define it in clinical psychological senses. In that lens, and then biblical theological lens, because I'm both in psychology, counseling, and theology. So I'll try to bring both of those areas and try to balance things out. So the psychological definition of boundary in the field of mental health counseling and family system therapy, clinical experts like Nidra Glover Tawab, she defines a boundary simply as a clear expectation of how you would like to be treated. It is the invisible line that defines where I end and where you begin. So it is the emotional and physical space between individuals. Let me illustrate it for you. So your 15-year-old comes home from school furious because they had a fight with their best friend. They stomp through the house, slam the doors, And when you ask how their day was, they snap at you. Leave me alone. You don't understand anything. So, if you have no emotional boundaries, your teenager's bad mood immediately becomes your bad mood. You internalize their anger. So, you get offended. Your anxiety spikes up and you start yelling back. The line between I and you has vanished here. So, you are allowing their emotional state to completely dictate your emotional reality. You recognize the invisible line here. You realize, oh, my teenager is having crisis, but I'm not having a crisis right now. So you separate the I from the you. So you calmly set the expectation of how you want to be treated. You can say, I can see that you are having a terrible day. You are very frustrated. However, I will not allow you to speak to me with that disrespectful tone. I'm going to the living room, I'm going to the kitchen to make some tea or snacks. When you are ready to speak to me calmly, I'm here to listen. So the result of that conversation would be, you have defined where their bad day ends and your peace begins. So you are in control of the situations. You are not running along with them in their emotional turmoil, but you are calmly setting a peace for them and for you. So we can go deeper into the actual physical science of the brain. Another clinical counselor specializing in neurobiology, Julianne Taylor Shore, she teaches that boundaries are not just arbitrary rules. They are biological signals that create what is called a neuroconception of safety. They are not arbitrary rules. They are biological signals that create what is called a neuroception of safety. Let me explain what that means. You see the slide here, the neuroception. So the human brain, specifically the central nervous system, is constantly scanning the environment to ask one question: am I safe? If an environment is chaotic, unpredictable, and has no clear clues, the central nervous system in our brain stays in a state of high alert. So the amygdala, the threat detection center of the brain, fires continuously, and this can lead to chronic anxiety to people. But when a home has a clear, consistent, and gently enforced boundaries, the central nervous system relaxes. It doesn't need to be in high alert anymore. Okay, I know what to do. I know what my parents expect. I know how to behave. So the brain says, I know exactly what the expectations are here. I know what happens if I cross the line. I don't have to guess. So paradoxically, children and teenagers who live in homes with zero boundaries are often the most highly anxious because they bear the terrifying burden of having to figure out the rules of the universe all by themselves because they did not have any boundaries at home. They don't know what to expect. A boundary creates a neuroception of safety. So your brain, your central nervous system scans the environment. Am I safe? Then it decides whether flight or fight or freeze. One of these three things will happen after scanning the environment. Now let me bring to the biblical definition. So how does the Bible define a boundary? When you read Genesis 1, we see God bringing order out of chaos. When the earth was formless and void, there was like a chaos that existed out there. And God is bringing everything into order. It is about God establishing the cosmos as his sacred temple. He does this by separating things. If you carefully read Genesis chapter 1, the first 3 days of creation, he creates and then he separates things. He separated the light from the darkness. He separated the waters above from the waters below. And he separated the land from the sea. What is this separation? So it is the establishment of boundaries, that your boundary is there, your boundary is here. Light has its boundary, darkness has its boundary. He established some boundaries. For example, if you look at Psalm 104, verse 9, you set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. In the same way, Proverbs chapter 8, verse 29, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundation of the earth. So it tells us that God has put boundaries to these things when he created. So a biblical boundary is a property line drawn by God to create ordered space for human flourishing. So it is a property line drawn by God to create ordered space for human flourishing. For example, when you build a house, you put fences in your backyard. Why do you put a fence up? You want to distinguish between your land and your neighbor's land. And it is also because you want to protect your children. You want your children to run safely and play safely within your boundaries and experience the joy of the outdoors without wandering into the street or maybe getting hit by a car if they run out and go into the streets. So you put boundaries, you put the walls or whatever the barricades, so you put it. So a boundary is not a wall that restricts. It is a fence that protects. So we need to understand that. It is not a wall that restricts. It is a fence that protects. And why do we need these boundaries anyway? So we know that it is a fence to protect and they are good. If boundaries are so good, why are they so hard to implement with your teenager? Why do we need them? We need them for two distinct reasons. One for the parent and one for the teenager. For the parent, it is to prevent burnout and resentment. Parenting teenagers is a marathon that requires immense emotional stamina. If you don't have boundaries, you will inevitably experience parental burnout. One of the best-selling life coach author, Nancy Levin, points out that the ultimate indicator that a boundary is missing in your life is the presence of resentment. So if you have resentment keep growing in your life, parenting your teens, it indicates that their boundary is missing. Think about the times you feel most resentful toward your teenager. You are cleaning up their room for the 100th time. You are staying up until 2 a.m. typing out their history project or science project because they procrastinated. You are handing them money for going out with their friends, even though they spoke to you disrespectfully all week. As you do these things, a bitter, angry resentment boils up within you, inside of you. You think, I do everything for them and they appreciate nothing. Why do I do all of this? So that resentment keeps boiling up inside. We usually blame the teenager for our resentment. But if I have to speak honestly, your resentment is not your teenager's fault. Your resentment is your own central nervous system warning you that you have failed to set a boundary. You are over-functioning. You are stepping across the property line into their yard, doing the work they should be doing, and then getting angry at them for it. Boundaries are desperately needed to protect the parent's emotional health. If you are burned out and resentful, you can't minister the grace of God to your child. We need boundaries for parents from preventing burnout and resentment. And number two, you need boundaries for the teenager because it is the process of individuation. So one of the Christian counselors, his name is John Townsend. He co-authored the groundbreaking book Boundaries with Teens. He explains that the primary developmental goal of adolescence is individuation. So what is individuation? Individuation is the psychological process where a child transitions from saying, I am an extension of my parents, to saying, oh, I am a distinct individual under God with my own thoughts, own convictions, and responsibilities. He is trying to individuate himself from you because he's trying to see himself as an individual under God with his own thoughts, convictions, and responsibilities. So that's what they're trying to do in the stage of adolescence. To achieve individuation, what they do, a teenager tries to push against things. They have to test the limits to figure out where they stand. It is biologically and developmentally necessary. If you, as a parent, provide a firm, loving boundary, they will push against that boundary. Have you ever experienced it? You say something and they try to push that against it because they want to test that boundary. They want to know where they can stand. That's their biological process. It's not something they are doing against you. It's the developmental necessity for their brain in this individuation process. So they will push against that boundary, and that boundary will hold, and then they will learn their limits. So you have to keep your boundary firmly. Otherwise, if you compromise or if you let it loose because they are pushing against it, and then so you are not teaching them where they will stand rightly. So you are giving them more lenience. But if you stand firm, so they will learn their limits because that's what they are trying to figure out. So let me give you an example. You have a 16-year-old son who wants to go to a movie with his friends on a Friday night. Before he leaves, you set a clear boundary. Have a great time, but your deadline is 10 p.m. If you are not home by 10, you will lose the privileges of taking the car next Friday. So notice, it is clear, it is loving, and the consequence is established before the rule is broken. Friday night happens, he takes the car, he goes out for a movie. At 10 p.m., he's not home. But at 10:15, he lets you know, Mom, Dad, I'm getting late. Sorry, the movie ran late. I'm grabbing food on my way. And then he finally walks through the doors at 10:45 or 11 p.m. And when he walks in, he's likely anticipating one of the two things based on his childhood. Either you are going to scream at him or you are going to let it slide because he had a good excuse. That is authoritarian versus permissive parent. He is unconsciously pushing against the boundary to see if it is made of concrete or paper. This is where the parent must manage their own anxiety. You do not yell at this situation. You do not give a 45-minute lecture on respect. You simply enforce the boundary with warmth and firmness. You say, I'm so glad you are home safe and I'm glad you had fun with your friends, but we agreed on 10 p.m. and it is 10:45 because you could not manage your time tonight. You won't be able to take the car out next Friday. We can try again this week after and then see if you will be able to responsibly manage your own time. So that's it. So your teenager will almost certainly get angry. He might say, that is so unfair. I told you the movie ran late. You never let me do anything. He might stomp up the stairs and slam his bedroom door. And as a parent, your instinct is to feel like you failed because he's angry. But psychologically, you just succeeded. He pushed against the boundary and the boundary held. You did not attack his character. You did not say you are an irresponsible liar. You simply let the natural consequence do the teaching. So the result, because of the boundary is held, his brain is learning the shape of reality. He's learning my parents' words mean exactly what they say. My actions have predictable consequences. If I want the freedom to go out, I have to take responsibility for the clock. He is individuating. He is realizing that he is a separate person who has to navigate the rules of the real world. And he is learning it in the safety of your home rather than learning it from a boss firing him after 10 years. But if you refuse to set the boundaries, you are a permissive parent who just wants to be their best friend. They will still have the developmental need to push. But because there is no boundary to push against, they will push against you if there is no boundary. They will push against your values, your faith, and your relationship until it breaks. So we must give them safe boundaries. to push against so that they can safely discover who God made them to be. I'll tell you my example. I went to a seminary for my MD. This was my first seminary back in India in 2011. I never had a habit of waking up at 4 a.m. So the seminary has a strict rule that whoever is pursuing Master of Divinity, they have to wake up at 4:30 a.m. and walk to the president's house 4 a.m. and then walk to the president's house by 4:30 a.m. Everybody must sit in the president's house and do the morning devotion until 5:30 a.m. I just went to the seminary. I did not have this habit. One day, it was the first day. Nobody woke up. The seminary was just starting. Nobody woke up because we are all not used to this system. And then the same day, the punishment comes. There is a 2-acre land with full of weeds and this much high of weeds on the trees. And then we have to pluck them by our bare hands. I felt so brutal. It is very unfair because I'm not used to this system. They should at least warn me. The punishment was like, you got to go and you have to pluck these trees. We plucked all of our classmates. We were like 20 people. We all plucked those weeds for like 1.5 to 2 hours. And then by the end of the day, all these things have have boils on my hands because we were plucking it bare hands. But from the next day, nobody missed the prayer meeting at 4:30 a.m. Everybody is on high alert in the brain. We must get up at 4:30. Alarm rings or doesn't ring. You wake up and you go. Because you don't want to see your hands getting pain every day. We didn't like it, but they taught us that. So there are some negatives and positives in that. But the positive thing is, yes, we all came into a system that is already established there. The boundaries help your children to navigate the real world. Some people say boundaries are opposite of grace. They don't give you freedom. As the small boy from Brother Charles, he said, barriers, it has a negative connotation. It doesn't have positive connotation. But we see that the children, how they think with the boundaries, they see that they are opposite of grace. And then they also try to, communicate. Doesn't the New Testament teach us to be people of grace? Didn't Jesus come to set us free from the law? If I enforce strict boundaries in my home, aren't I being a legalistic Pharisee and an obstacle to their freedom? Now, this is a great misconception of modern parenting. We have created a false dichotomy between grace and boundaries. To understand this, we need to look at the laws in the Old Testament, the ultimate set of boundaries God gave to Israelites. We also need to see the sequence of things here. First, God rescued the Israelites from slavery. Is that what he did? When they were in Egypt crying out under the slavery, so God rescued them. That was the first act. And then he defeated the Pharaoh at the same time. And then he parted the Red Sea. He saved them by pure, unmerited grace while they were completely helpless. This all had taken place prior. Then God has given them the law. After they were being saved, after they were being delivered from this slavery, then when they came to the foot of the Mount Sinai, that's when God gave them the law. So therefore, the boundary is not a prerequisite for grace. The boundary is a response to grace. Boundaries are the shape that grace takes in a fallen world to keep us from returning to slavery. God showed the grace first and then he gave them the law. So boundary is not a prerequisite for grace, but the boundary is a response to grace. So I'm going to John Townsend, who wrote the Boundaries with Teens. So he offers a brilliant formula for this. He says that true biblical parenting requires two things. Number one, love, and number two, limits. Love and limits. Love without limits is permissive enablement. If you give your teens endless grace but no boundaries, you will raise an entitled, insecure child who believes the universe revolves around them. That is love without limits. So if you see limits without love, is authoritarian legalism. If you give teens strict boundaries but no grace, no warmth, and no forgiveness, you will raise an angry, anxious rebel who cannot wait to escape your house. So you see the difference between love without limits and limits without love. You have problem with both of them. What you need is love plus limits. You need both of them. That is what is covenantal parenting. It says, I love you unconditionally. And because I love you unconditionally, I will not allow you to destroy yourself. True freedom is not the absence of boundaries. Grace without boundaries produces entitled rebels, and boundaries without grace produces anxious Pharisees. True freedom is not the absence of boundaries. For example, think of a fish. A fish is completely free as long as it stays within the boundary of the water. If the fish decides it wants to be free from the restrictive boundary of the water and jumps onto a dry land, it doesn't find freedom. What does it find? It finds death. Boundaries do not restrict our teenagers' freedom. They are the very environment that makes true freedom possible. We should ask, why did God give boundaries to us? If we want to parent like God parents us, we need to study the biblical pattern of how God established boundaries throughout the biblical history. Let's trace this thread through the scriptures and see what it says. For example, number one, Eden. In the Garden of Eden, God places Adam and Eve in a paradise of perfect provision. But he gives them one explicit boundary. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. That's what God says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 16 to 17. Why did God put that tree there? Was he playing a cruel psychological game? Was he trying to restrict their joy? No, absolutely not. The boundary of the tree was there to teach creaturely dependence. It was a daily physical reminder that they were the creation, not the creator. They need to trust God's definition of what was good and what was evil rather than defining it for themselves. So when Adam and Eve ate fruit, they committed the first boundary violation in human history. They stepped over the property line. And notice how God responds here. He doesn't fly into chaotic, emotionally dysregulated rage. He enacts the logical consequence of the boundary violation, which is exile from the garden. He puts them out of the garden. But look at, even in his discipline, he covers them with animal skin. He provides grace within the boundary enforcement. We must not forget to give grace even when people fall, even when children make mistakes, even though we don't like it. Just as God helped them, covered them with animal skins, he took care of their shame and then he helped them at that point, but also he enforced the boundary that he has set. And then if you look at Cain, in Genesis 4, we see the story of Cain and Abel. When God looks with favor on Abel's offering but not on Cain's, Cain becomes furious. His face is downcast. He is dysregulated. Listen to the boundary that God is trying to establish for Cain here. God asks Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. God is giving Cain an emotional boundary here. He's saying, Cain, your anger is a reality, but it does not have to be your master. You have a choice. You must draw a line and rule over your impulses. But Cain refuses the boundary. He lets his anger consume him and commits the first murder. From this, we learn that part of our job as parents is to give our teenagers emotional boundaries, to teach them that just because they feel an intense emotion, they do not have the right to act violently or disrespectfully. Their emotion might be right, but they don't have that right to act violently or disrespectfully. Let's see further. So, Noah, after the devastating judgment of the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah. World before the flood had become completely unmoved. Violence filled the earth because humanity recognized no boundaries, and God has brought his judgment and wiped all the humanity. In Genesis 9, God establishes a boundary, a profound boundary regarding the sanctity of human life. He says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made mankind." So God institutes this severe boundary to prevent the world from sliding back into complete anarchy. He is placing a limit on human vengeance here. This boundary preserves the social order. Now you guys are starting the human race again. So here is a social order. Here is a limit that I'm placing upon you. Nobody should kill anybody. It teaches us that boundaries are necessary because human beings are entirely capable of destroying one another if left to our own fallen devices. We set boundaries in our homes to protect the vulnerable and preserve peace. So, number 4, finally, we come to the Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are not a prison sentence. They are covenantal marriage document. I'll explain what does it mean. Imagine a playground situated at the very top of a steep jagged cliff. If there are no fences around the edge of that cliff, how will the children play? They will huddle in the dead center of the playground. They will be terrified to move around. They will be paralyzed by the fear of falling off the edge because there is a great cliff. It's an edge. They are afraid of falling because there is no fence around it. Children are so afraid. There is no joy, no running, no freedom for them. But if you built a massive 10-foot high reinforced steel fence right along the edge of the cliff, what happens? The children can run freely, they can play tag, they can explore and they can experience total freedom because they know the boundary will keep them from falling to their deaths. So the 10 Commandments are the fence around the cliff of human destruction. So do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal. God is saying with all of these, stay within these boundaries and you will find life, joy, and peace. If you step outside of them, you will find death. You will destroy yourself and you will destroy the whole community. When you set a boundary regarding your teenagers' screen time or their curfew or the way they speak to their mother or father, you are not building a prison there. You are building a fence on the edge of a cliff. You are creating a safe playground where their soul can actually flourish. That's what you are trying to do. So let me go to the progression from the Old Testament to New Testament. If we want to fully understand the biblical theology of the boundaries, we have to look at this massive shift that happens between the Old and New Testaments. And how did Jesus handle boundaries? Well, in the Old Testament, they are like external boundaries for a holy nation. The boundaries were largely external. Israel was called to be a holy priesthood, a light to the surrounding nations. To maintain their distinct identity and keep them from being absorbed into the surrounding nations and their practices, God was giving them these special laws for them, that they maintain their distinct identity and keep them from being absorbed into these pagan cultures of Canaan. God gave them highly visible external boundaries. What they ate, what they wore, how they farmed, all of these were strictly regulated to preserve them physically and spiritually. When our children are young, our boundaries look very much like the Old Testament. They are highly external. We dictate what they eat, when they sleep, what they wear, and who they play with. They do not have an internal capacity to make those choices safely. So the parents serve as the external boundary line here when they were small. But when you come to the New Testament, the prophets promised the day when the new covenant will be made, the boundaries would change. For example, Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 33, it says, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people." What is God doing here? He is internalizing the boundaries. So in the Old Testament, we see the externality. They are external. But in the New Testament, God is internalizing them because God is giving the Holy Spirit. He is the one who is guiding us with His Spirit when the new covenant was made. So when Jesus Christ arrives onto this earth, He fulfills this promise. When you read the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, Jesus does not abolish Old Testament boundaries. He deepens them. That's what He says. He did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Sometimes we mistakenly think that Jesus has come and removed all the Old Testament laws. No, there are civil, ceremonial, and moral laws. The ceremonial laws were gone because Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice, has been made. So there is no more ritualistic practices that we need to do because Christ, the ultimate sacrifice, was made. So all the ceremonial laws became obsolete. But Jesus deepens these moral laws. Within the civil laws, you have the moral law also. Because in the civil law, you cannot murder anybody in your society. But that is also moral law. So they are combined, woven together intrinsically. So Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So what became obsolete is the ceremonial law. But you see the other laws here. For example, you read here, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22. "You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, 'You fool,' will be liable to the hell of fire." So he is deepening the law which was already given. "You shall not murder" is the law. See how he is deepening that? Well, let's look one more. "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" Adultery in the Old Testament sense was external. You go and lie with another woman who is a wife to somebody else and then you commit adultery there. But see what Jesus is doing here? He is deepening that. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So he is deepening those laws of the Old Testament. So Jesus is taking the boundary line and moving it from physical hands to the invisible heart. Because of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, the New Testament believers does not just obey an external list of rules out of fear. They obey because their desires have been transformed by grace. Because we desire God, we seek the kingdom of God. Our heart has been transformed by the grace of God. Holy Spirit is residing within us, empowering us. So externality in the Old Testament became internality. In the childhood we dictate, but when they are growing, we have to let them internalize those boundaries. The goal of parenting teens, this progression from OT to NT perfectly mirrors the progression of raising child into an adult. Because the ultimate goal of parenting a teenager is to help them transition from Old Testament relationship with your rules to a New Testament relationship with the Holy Spirit. So when they are 5 years old, you hold their hand in the parking lot. You hold their hand while we walk on the road. That is an external boundary. But you cannot hold their hand when they are 15 because, they have grown up. You have to train them so that the boundary of looking both ways and being careful becomes internalized in them. So, in the teenage years, our job is to slowly, deliberately transfer the burden of boundary keeping from external enforcement to their internal conviction. We want to move them from saying, I won't look at pornography on my phone because my dad installed a monitoring app and he will ground me. But we want them to say, I won't look at pornography on my phone because it violates the holiness of God. It degrades the image of God in others. And it grieves the Holy Spirit within me. That's the reason I don't want to do it. So we want them to be transition from the external rules to internalizing. So this is the transition from law to grace. So this is the architecture of a Christian boundary. So I have spent quite a bit of time on the first part. I have so much on the second part. I want to pause here. Welcome back, everyone. Take a deep breath. We are going to fly a little bit now into deeper stuff. In the first hour, we laid a massive theological and psychological foundation. We looked at the architecture of grace. We established that boundaries are not acts of hostility, nor are they a rejection of our Indian family values. Rather, boundaries are the property lines God draws to create ordered space for human flourishing. So we saw that grace without boundaries produces entitled rebels, and boundaries without grace produces anxious Pharisees. But I know exactly what you are thinking during the break. You were thinking, Pastor, I hear all of this, it's all good. But when it is 11:30 p.m. on a school night and my 15-year-old is refusing to hand over their smartphone and they are rolling their eyes at me, my brain isn't thinking about all this theology that you are talking about. My brain is thinking about the flying chapel. I understand completely. As a pastor and as someone who has studied psychology and counseling, I know that theory is, if it is just theory, is useless if it doesn't work in your living room. So for the rest of our time today, we are putting on our hard hats. We are leaving the theoretical realm and entering into the trenches of daily parenting. We are going to look at the neurobiology of the teenage brain, how to negotiate boundaries around the screens and friendships, and I'm going to give you the exact clinically proven practices you can use to enforce these boundaries with absolute peace. So let's dive into the part 2, the application of grace. We need to understand, if you are going to effectively set a boundary with a teenager, you must first understand the biological machine they are operating. When you set a perfectly reasonable boundary, like please clean up your room before you go out with your friends, and your teenager explodes in a fit of rage, slams their door, and screams that you are ruining their life, you are left completely confused. You think, why are they acting like a maniac? I just asked them to pick up their laundry. To understand this, we have to look at adolescent neurobiology. Let me talk to you about the Ferrari with bicycle brakes. During adolescence, human brain undergoes a massive remodeling process. There are two specific parts of the brain you need to understand: the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So the amygdala is the emotional threat detection center of the brain. It is responsible for the fight, flight, or freeze response. During the teenage years, the amygdala is fully developed and highly hyperactive. Teenagers feel emotions, anger, joy, embarrassment, fear at a volume of 11 out of 10. Everything feels like a matter of life and death to them. So on the other hand, we have the prefrontal cortex. This is the front part of the brain responsible for logic, rational decision making, impulse control, and understanding long-term consequences. Here is the terrifying biological truth. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until a person is roughly 25 years old. In the counseling world, we say that, a teenager's brain is like a Ferrari engine equipped with bicycle brakes. They have a massive emotional horsepower, the amygdala, but virtually no ability to stop themselves or think through the consequences. The prefrontal cortex. As Indian parents, we often expect 25-year-old reasoning from a 14-year-old boy. That is a biological impossibility. You can't do that. Let me talk about the neuroception of threat. I mentioned this in the first part. When you understand this biology, it changes how you see their rebellion. Clinical neurobiology experts like, Julian Taylor Shore teaches about a concept called this neuroception. This is the brain's subconscious ability to detect safety or threat. Because your teenager's prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, they biologically perceive your boundaries not as loving guidance, but as a direct threat to their autonomy and social survival. When you say, you cannot go to the late night party, their logical brain doesn't say, my parents love me and want to protect me from bad influences. That's not how they think. Instead, their amygdala fires off alarm bells to them. If I don't go to this party, I will be socially ostracized. I will die a social death. My parents are trying to destroy my life. That's what their brain is telling them. If you try to enforce a boundary by yelling, screaming, or using physical intimidation, you are pouring a gasoline on their amygdala. Their brain literally registers your yelling as a physical attack, similar to a tiger jumping out of the jungle. When their amygdala is hijacked, their logic center completely shuts down. They cannot learn the moral lesson you are trying to teach them while you are screaming at them, because their brain is in pure survival mode at this point. So you must act as your teenager's external prefrontal cortex. You have to hold the line of logic and calm when they are spinning out of control. When they slam the door, you don't take it personally. You take a deep breath, remind yourself they are not an evil mastermind. They are a teenager with a Ferrari engine and they don't have right brakes, they just have a bicycle brakes. I will hold the boundary and I will be their anchor. That's how we need to act, knowing that they are like a Ferrari with bicycle brakes. Number 7, what is the rigid rules versus covenantal boundary difference? Where do we strike the balance? Because teenagers are emotionally volatile, parents often default to one of two extremes to keep the peace. I talked about Diana Baumrind's parenting model. I gave you the chart. She talked about 3 kinds of parenting styles: authoritarian, permissive, and then mixed of authoritarian and permissive. So she famously categorized parenting into different styles, and as Indian parents, we usually swing violently between these 2 of them, authoritarian versus permissive. We either be in one of these camps. We must abandon both of these and move toward a third way. Authoritative, or what I call covenantal parenting. We need to be authoritative, at the same time we need to be showing grace. So that is what I call, covenantal parenting. Let's look at the difference between these rigid rules and covenantal boundaries. A rigid rule is based on authoritarian parenting. It sounds like, you will do this because I said so. If you disobey, I will make you suffer. We warned. So rules here are an attempt to control the teenager. We say, you will not disrespect me, you will get straight A's, you will not look at bad things on the internet. But there is terrifying and liberating truth we should hear. That is, you cannot control your teenager. You could lock them in an empty room and they could still choose to hate you in their minds. You cannot control their choices, their friends, or their internal desires. When you try to control a teenager with rigid authoritarian rules, you provoke them to wrath. Exactly what Apostle Paul is warning us in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 4. Let me read Ephesians chapter 6 verse 4. He says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Do not provoke them. If you behave like an authoritarian, so you put rigid authoritarian rules, you provoke them to wrath. Either they will be highly anxious sneaks who learn how to lie to you better, or they will openly rebel. They would do one of these two things. The reality of influence is that the covenantal boundary requires massive paradigm shift here. That a boundary does not try to control the teenager. A boundary controls the parent and the environment. A rule says, "You must respect me, or else I will scream at you." So this is trying to control them. But boundary says, "I love you, but I will not stay in the same room and engage in a conversation with you while you are speaking to me disrespectfully. I am going to the kitchen or to the lawn. When you lower your voice, I would love to continue to listen to you." You control yourself and you control the environment. So you won't put a rigid rule over there, but you draw a healthy boundary. Do you see the difference between those two? The boundary removes the power struggle. You are not forcing them to change their tone right then and there. You are simply defining what you will do if they cross the property line. Let's look at another example. A rule says you must be home at 10 p.m. And if you are late, you are grounded for a month. That is like a retributive action. But boundary says your curfew, your strict timeline is 10 p.m. If you cannot manage your time and be home by 10, then you are showing me you are not ready for the responsibility of the car, and you will lose driving privileges for the rest of the week. So you give the logical consequence. Covenantal boundaries strike the perfect biblical balance, are high in warmth and grace, but they are absolutely unwavering in truth and consequences. They teach the teenager that gravity exists, and if you step off the roof, the parent won't hate you, but the parent also, won't catch you to protect you from the broken leg. The natural consequence is the teacher here. Not literally, of course, but that's the natural consequence. You are trying to let the natural consequence teach your children. We need to understand the difference between setting a rigid rule versus a covenantal boundary, a healthy boundary. Before we talk about where to put boundaries on your teenagers, we have to talk about the most uncomfortable subject in the counseling room. In the family system therapy, most of the times, the biggest boundary problem in a home is often not the rebellious teenager. It is the overstepping parent. In our culture, we have a profound problem with what psychologists called enmeshment. We talked about Jacob's family last time, how enmeshed the family is. So the enmeshment is when the emotional boundaries between parent and child completely collapse. We don't just love our children, we fuse our identities with them. Their success is our success, their low score is our humiliation. Their bad behavior is our humiliation. Maybe if you have heard from some of the Indian parents say, we are applying to medical school this year, or we got a 98% on the board exam. They don't say, my child got it. They say, we got it and we are applying. Because we are enmeshed, we view our child's achievements as our own public relations campaign and their failures as our own personal humiliation. If we are going to raise a healthy, gospel-centered adults, we must draw the line on ourselves first. Parents, you need 3 specific boundaries on your own behavior. Let me walk through them. Number one, emotional differentiation. Differentiation is your ability to maintain your emotional stability when the people around you are unstable. If your teenager comes home in a terrible, grumpy mood, does the whole house have to walk on eggshells? Because they are the ones who are not in good mood. Because of them, all the house, should they all need to walk on eggshells? Does their bad mood ruin your family evening? If so, you lack an emotional boundary. You must learn to let your teenager have a bad day without you having a bad day. You have to silently say to yourself, my child is dysregulated now, they are suffering, I love them, and I will offer a listening ear. I will hug them, I will console them. But their emotional storm is not my emotional storm. So I don't want to ruin the rest of the family's emotions. I am safely anchored. I can safely guide their emotions. We can empathize with them, but you don't need to ruin your evening or your whole family time. So when you stop riding their emotional roller coaster, you actually become the calming presence they desperately need. You need to have emotional differentiation so that you would guide them better and you would maintain the peace for the rest of the family members. Number two, rescuing boundaries. When kids were very young, we were in helicopter parenting model. Helicopter parenting is an over involved, overprotective style where parents hover to micromanage their child's life, which is often driven by fear or anxiety. When kids were younger, we were doing helicopter parenting. But when the kids grow into teenage years, we have entered into the lawnmower parenting. A lawnmower parent walks in front of their teenager and mows down every single obstacle, failure, and inconvenience so the child never has to struggle. So that's what we try to do from helicopter parenting to lawnmower parenting. We move, but we need to stop being the lawnmower for our teens. So if your 16-year-old leaves their science project on the kitchen table irresponsibly, what do? The lawnmower parent drops everything. So misses a meeting at work and drives the project to the school so the child doesn't get zero. If it is real, genuine forgetfulness, we can understand. But if it is irresponsible, you are telling them, did you pack everything in the bag? So make sure you have everything, and then they know they have to keep everything intact in the night before because they have to go to school next day. In the morning, they don't have much time. If they act irresponsibly, you can't do their job. You must set a boundary on your own rescuing behavior. If you rescue them from the natural consequences of their laziness at age 16 or 14 or 15, who is going to rescue them when they are like 26? And miss a deadline at their job. Grace does not mean preventing the failure. Grace means loving them unconditionally through the failure. Let them get a zero on the science project. So let them experience the pain of a missed deadline while the stakes are small and they are still living in your house, so they don't lose their career or their marriage when the stakes are infinitely higher. So you got to let them learn the lesson. If you try to be like a lawnmower parent, you are ruining their career in the long run. You are ruining their life in the long run. You have to stop being like a helicopter parent and a lawnmower parent. You need to guard that. Number three, the privacy boundaries. As children growing into adolescents, they require a physical and a psychological boundary of privacy to individuate. Many of us struggle with this. We think it's my house, my rules. I can read their diary and search their room whenever I want. But clinical experts are very clear on this. Snooping destroys trust. And once the trust is destroyed, your teenager will never come to you when they are in a real trouble. So there is a massive difference between safety monitoring versus snooping. Safety monitoring is overt. You say to them, because the internet is dangerous, I have installed a filter on your phone and I have the right to spot check your social media. I'm telling you this upfront. So you set that expectation to your child. So you safely monitor them. Whereas snooping is secret. It is sneaking into their room at 2 a.m. to read their private texts to their best friend. You must draw a boundary on your curiosity. Respect their private space. Knock before you enter their bedroom and treat their growing autonomy with dignity. This is where they will individuate themselves because they are in the process of individuating. This sounds very American for Indian parents. I do understand that. But you need to hear what the clinical experts say on this. So you can ask if you want to check their messages, you can ask, hey, can I have your phone? I want to see the text. Many times you will get no. But if you have built enough trust that you won't outrightly judge them and curse them, they would give you. So it depends on the trust relationship. This is for parents. So you need to have emotional boundaries, you need to have rescuing boundaries, and you need to have privacy boundaries. Now that we have drawn the line on ourselves as parents, where do our teenagers desperately need us to establish boundaries? I'm gonna take 3 different battlegrounds and then I'll give you boundaries for them on what level. Mostly there are many levels that we can put the boundaries, but since we don't have much time, I'm going to talk about 3 levels here. For teenagers navigating the modern world, so there are 3 primary battlegrounds where they need your covenantal boundaries to survive. So the battleground number 1, the digital and screen domain. We touched on this earlier. In our last session also we touched on this, but we must expand on it. The smartphone is not a neutral tool. It is a spiritual and psychological environment. If you hand a 13-year-old an unrestricted smartphone, you are essentially dropping them off alone in the middle of Times Square at midnight and hoping that they would make right choices. That's what you are trying to do. You must establish robust digital boundaries. So the time boundaries. The phone goes into the charging station in the kitchen at 9 p.m. No screens in the bedroom overnight. Why? Because the teenager lacks the impulse control to stop scrolling when the algorithm is feeding them endless dopamine. If the phone is in the bedroom, they will not sleep. And sleep deprivation is the number 1 accelerator of teenage anxiety and depression. Number 2, intellectual boundaries. You must set boundaries on what they consume. We protect our kids' physical diets. We want to give them healthy food, right? So mothers cook healthy food at home. And they don't want to give them junk food. They want to feed healthy. They want to protect their physical diet. We wouldn't let them eat garbage from a dumpster. But we let them consume intellectual and spiritual garbage on TikTok for 6 hours a day, 4 hours a day. You must have boundaries around violent content, explicit media, and the endless stream of secular influencers who are actively catechizing them away from the Christian worldview. So you need to have that digital boundary. So number 2, the friendship and peer influence. Teenagers are highly peer oriented. They will often compromise their own values just to feel included. We need to teach them how to set boundaries with their own friends. One of the biggest issues we see in pastoral counseling right now is teenagers carrying the severe mental health burdens of their peers, because Gen Z is struggling so deeply with depression and self-harm. Your teenager might have a friend who texts them at midnight saying, I don't want to live anymore. Then your teenager, out of love for them, will try to become their friend's savior. So they carry this psychological massive burden that would crush an adult psychiatrist, and they won't let you know that. They carry it by themselves. You must teach your teen emotional boundaries. You have to teach them to say to their friends, I love you so much, but this is too heavy for us to handle alone. we have to tell an adult about this. They need boundaries to protect themselves from toxic friendships, gossip circles, and the pressure to conform. You have to teach them that the word no is a complete sentence. For a teenager, mastering this concept is a superpower actually. I'll tell you why. When the teenagers learn that no is a complete sentence, it means the word no does not require a comma followed by a paragraph of excuses, apologies, or justifications. It can simply end with a period. In psychology, there is a boundary setting acronym that is called JADE. JADE. It stands for justify, argue, defend, and explain. When a teenager feels pressured by a peer to do something they don't want to do, their natural instinct is to JADE. Justify, argue, defend, and explain. Example, I can't go to that party with you tonight because my parents are really strict and I have a huge biology test tomorrow and my stomach is kind of hurting and I don't have a ride. So instead of saying no, they give all these excuses. They try to justify their no and they try to argue. They are not setting a boundary at this point. They are starting a negotiation with their friend. A toxic friend will immediately start dismantling all their justifications. Oh, you don't have a ride? Oh, I'll give you a ride. I'll take you. Oh, you can study on Sunday. Oh, your parents won't even know this. If they start to justify, they will be dismantled by a toxic friend. They will give a lot of reasons why they should not think what they are thinking is right. Your child starts negotiating and gets into the compromise of going where they are going and doing what they are asking him or her to do. So teaching them that no is a complete sentence means teaching them to say, no, I'm not going tonight, period. When there are no excuses offered, there is nothing for the peer to argue against. So this concept is incredibly disruptive for an Indian audience because in our culture, saying a direct no to someone, especially a friend, an elder, or a family member, it feels aggressively rude in our Indian culture. So we are socially conditioned to over-explain, soften the blow, and tell polite white lies to preserve harmony and avoid making the other person feel bad. So we don't say straight no. That's a huge problem for us. We must teach our teenagers that clarity is kind. Why clarity is kind? When you teach a teenager that clarity is kind, you are teaching them that most respectful thing they can do for a friend is to tell them the truth gently. Clarity is kind because it honors the other person's time. They don't have to wait for a maybe. It prevents resentment. When we say yes but mean no inside, we become resentful and passive aggressive inside of us. No, I don't want to go, but these guys want me to go. There is that resentment that grows and it builds trust when there is a clarity. People feel safe around people who are clear. Even if they don't like the answer, they know they can trust the person. So you do not have to be mean to say no, but you do have to be firm. You can say no, thank you, or no, I'm not comfortable with that. That is not rude. That is a healthy emotional boundary. Teach your kids that no is a complete sentence. And if they persist, kindly and firmly say, no, I'm not comfortable with that. So we see the biblical foundation. For example, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, Jesus says, all you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from evil one. Well, Jesus is specifically teaching about oaths and integrity, but the psychological principle holds true here. Your word should have enough weight to stand on its own without you having to prop it up with elaborate justifications. Look at Jesus' life here in Mark chapter 1, verses 35 to 38. He was a master of saying no as a complete sentence. Here, Jesus rose very early in the morning. He went away while it was still dark. And he went into a desolate place, and there he was praying. And Simon, those who were with him, searched for him. And they found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." And Jesus said to them, "Let us go on to the next town, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." Jesus could have used JADE. He could have said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I'm really tired, and I have been healing people all day, and I just need a mental health break." That's not what Jesus said. Instead, Jesus essentially says no as a complete sentence. He says, "Let us go somewhere else to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That is why I have come." He stated his boundary and his vocation, and he moved on. How to teach this to teens? Here is a practical exercise to do with your kids. Sit with your teenager down and role play with them. Have them practice looking you in the eye and saying, "No, I don't want to do that." Tell them they don't have to apologize for protecting their own conscience, their own body, or their own time. When they learn that no is a complete sentence, they become immune to peer pressure, because no longer they feel the need to argue for their right to be safe. So try this exercise multiple times. Sit down with your teenager and do the role play multiple times at multiple times so that they get used to this system. Number 3, material and respect boundaries in the home. Your home must be an embassy of grace, but it must also be a training ground for reality. Teenagers need material boundaries. They need to understand that the physical environment of the home is a shared space. If they leave their dirty dishes in the living room, they are violating the material boundary. If they demand that you buy them the newest iPhone because everyone else has one, they are violating the financial boundary. They need boundaries. They also need boundaries regarding respect. In our homes, we must have a zero tolerance policy for verbal abuse. Anger is natural. It is a God-given emotion. Even Jesus got angry. But what you do with that anger is where the boundary lies. So you must teach them, you are allowed to be incredibly angry with me. You are allowed to tell me you are angry, but you are not allowed to call me names, swear at me, or punch holes in the drywall. By establishing these battleground boundaries, you are equipping them with the exact skills they will need to negotiate with a difficult boss, a future spouse, or a hostile culture. So you need to establish boundaries in different levels. With that, I will go to the final one, which is very important. I'm going to take 3 clinically proven practices from 3 different clinical psychologists and neurobiologists, and then give you these 3. How parents can teach boundaries to their teens. We have theology now, we have neurobiology that we studied. We know the battlegrounds. Now, how do we actually execute this without losing our minds? Number 1, co-creation. So when your child is 5, you are the dictator. You set the rules and they obey. But your teenager is 15, and if you still try to play the dictator, you will face massive rebellion. You must transition to becoming a consultant. So co-creation means giving your older teenagers a voice, but not the final say in establishing the boundaries. Sit down with them on a Saturday afternoon when everyone is calm. And also never try to set a boundary during a fight, during an argument. Say to them when they are calm, you are getting older and I want to give you more freedom. Let's talk about boundaries. What do you think is a reasonable time to be home on a Friday night? And what do you think the consequence should be if you miss it? You ask them. You are co-creating with them. You will be shocked to hear the consequences that they will tell you. Oftentimes, teenagers will suggest stricter consequences for themselves than you would have. When they co-create a boundary, they take psychological ownership of it. If they break the curfew, they are not fighting your unfair rule. They are fighting their own agreed upon consequence. It builds internal responsibility because they have created this boundary for themselves. Number two, the green, yellow, red framework. Escalation without yelling. Melissa Urban developed a brilliant framework for communicating boundaries that prevents you from losing your temper. It works like a traffic light. The green, the gentle request. This is a slow threat, polite statement of your need and assume the best. For example, hey, please put your phone away while we are eating at dinner. So most of the time this works. But if they ignore and keep scrolling the phone, you escalate to yellow zone. The clear boundary plus consequence. So now you are going to the yellow zone. This is no longer a request. You are stating the property line, the boundary, and the exact consequence. Your tone is firm and completely calm here. For example, I need you to put the phone in your pocket right now. If you choose to keep it on the table, I'll take it. And you will lose it for the rest of the evening. You have given them a choice. They can choose obedience or they can choose the consequence. If they roll their eyes and keep scrolling, then you move to the another level. You go to the red. This level is enforcement. Red means no more warnings, no more negotiations, and absolutely no lecturing at this point. You simply enforce the consequence. You stand up, calmly pick up the phone from the table, put it in your pocket and say, you can have this back tomorrow morning. Then you sit down and ask them to pass other dishes for you. So the genius of the red stage is that it requires absolutely zero words. Indian parents love to lecture. We love to give them 45-minute speech about how disrespectful they are while we take the phone. No, you don't need to lecture. The lecture hijacks their amygdala, I told you earlier. The calm, silent enforcement of the boundary is 10 times more powerful than your yelling. Now I know exactly what you are thinking. You are thinking, Pastor, this traffic light system sounds great in a psychology textbook, but if I calmly put my 16 years old phone in my pocket, they are not going to just sit there and pass the chicken curry. They are going to explode. You are absolutely right. If you have never held a boundary like this before, that's what they are going to do. They are going to test it with everything they have. I told you they push against the boundary so that they know where they can stand, right? So they might leave the table, slam their bedroom door, scream at you, or even try to physically grab the phone back. In psychology, this is called extinction burst. They are turning up the heat to see if your boundary will melt. How you handle the next 60 seconds will define your relationship for the next 6 months. Here is exactly what you do in those 3 scenarios. I'll give you these 3 scenarios. They slam the door, they yell at you, or they try to physically grab the phone from you. First scenario, for example, they storm off and slam the door. In Indian culture, if a child walks away while parent is speaking, it is considered the ultimate disrespect. Our immediate instinct is to follow them down the hallway, kick the door open and shout, do not turn your back on me. Do not follow them. Do not follow them. Clinically speaking, when a dysregulated teenager storms off to their room, they are actually executing a crude coping mechanism. They are retreating to lower their heart rate. If you follow them into their room to demand respect, you are cornering a wild animal in its cage. A fight will escalate violently. What do you do if you put a cat in a room and then you are trying to chase it? It's going to attack you fiercely. The same thing happens here. What you need to do? So you need to let them go. The boundary was about the phone and you have the phone. You have executed the consequence. You have already won. Sit at the table, finish your dinner, and let them cool down so you can address the door slamming tomorrow when the prefrontal cortex is back online. Because when you are yelling, it shuts down for them and it is not fully developed yet. Whatever the small they have, it shuts down. They're not going to think. So number 2 scenario, They yell, they insult, and they demand the phone. If they stay in the room and start screaming at you, saying you are unfair, you are the worst parent, and they hate you, your amygdala is going to scream at you to yell back. Do not engage the content of their yelling. When a teenager is in rage, you never let me do anything and you reply, I just let you go to the movies on Tuesday, and you start to argue with him. He says, you never let me do this, you never let me do that, and then you try to argue with him. You just are trying to get in an argument now. So you are not setting a clear boundary and you are not maintaining that. So you are engaging with the content that he is yelling at. Don't do that. So what you need to do, use the broken record technique. So what is it? Keep your voice low, completely devoid of emotion. Look at them calmly and repeat your script. I love you, but the phone stays with me until tomorrow morning. I'm not going to argue with you, and that's it. If they keep yelling, simply turn around and walk away. You remove your presence, and then that diffuses the power. You calmly navigate the situation. You don't try to engage in that content that he is trying to bring it out. Number 3 scenario, they try to physically grab the phone. So this is the most terrifying scenario. If they lunge or try to snatch the phone out of your pocket or your hand, the line of physical safety has been crossed. Do not play tug of war here. If you grab their arm or try to physically wrestle the phone away from this teenager, someone is going to get hurt and trust will be shattered. Instead, what you need to do, step back immediately to create a physical distance. Put your hands up in a non-threatening posture. Say very firmly and loudly, stop. I will not fight you physically. Do not touch me. And walk into a room with a locking door, bedroom or bathroom, or lock it. Put the phone in a drawer. This is not retreating out of weakness. Don't think in that way that you are being weak at this point. No. So this is a massive visible boundary that you are communicating to your teenager, saying, physical aggression will instantly shut down my presence. Then what you need to do? You don't let it continue like that. You need to have a reconciliation. When the extinction burst is over, he has calmed down. Whether it takes an hour or an entire night, the teenager will calm down after some time. And what you do at that time? You do exactly what God does with us. You initiate the reconciliation without apologizing for the boundary. The next morning, you hand the phone back. You do not demand an apology from them. You do not give another lecture to them. You simply say, yesterday really got heated. I love you and I am always here for you. But the boundary remains. Let's try to have a better evening tonight. When you survive the extinction burst without losing your teen temper, so your teenager's brain learns a profound lesson. They learn that you are an unshakable anchor. They learn that their anger cannot destroy you, and your love for them will not be broken by their bad behavior. That is the architecture of gospel at home. So number 3, finally, I want to give you exact scripts to use when your teenager is pushing your buttons. Communication experts like Kami Orange specialize in phrases that de-escalate tension while holding a firm boundary. In our culture, when teenager yells at us, our default script is guilt tripping. We say, how dare you? After everything I have sacrificed, or after everything that I have done for you, is that what you repay to me? Your father worked 60 hours a week for you, and this is how you repay us? This is guilt trip. And this guilt trip is terrible psychology and terrible theology. It's like a pure karma. It breeds resentment, not repentance. Instead, I want you to memorize these direct boundary setting scripts. When they are yelling at you, you can say, I love you too much to have an argument while we are both this angry. Or you can say, our relationship is so valuable to me that I refuse to let us damage it by screaming at each other right now. I'm going to step away. Let's talk about this in an hour when we have both calmed down. Then physically walk away. You have drawn a boundary around your own dignity. So when they are arguing against a consequence you already set, you can say in this way, I know you are disappointed that you can't use the car tonight or mobile tonight. I would be disappointed too, but my decision is final and I'm not going to debate it anymore. You are validating their emotion that they are disappointed, but you are still holding the line. And when they try to manipulate you by saying, everyone else's parents let them do it, you don't let me do it. You are such a horrible parent. It sounds very cruel and rude to us. But this is what you need to say. It sounds like their parents have a different set of rules for their family. In our family, this is the boundary we have set because we believe it is best for you. And do not fall into the trap of defending your rules against imaginary other parents. Just tell them, this is our family boundary. This is what we follow in our family. My friends, setting boundaries is exhausting work. It requires you to be courageous. It requires you to be tolerate the temporary anger of your teenager so that you secure their long-term flourishing. But I want to remind you of the gospel here. Jesus Christ is the ultimate boundary keeper. He established the boundary on the cross. He said, sin stops here. Death stops here. Condemnation stops here. He set the ultimate boundary. Because he held that boundary, you and I are completely free from sin. We are saved. Death is no longer in us. Even though we die physically, we will live forever. And there is no condemnation because he set those boundaries on the cross. When you set loving, firm, covenantal boundaries in your home, you are reflecting the character of God to your teenagers. You are creating a neuroception of safety. You are building a fence around the cliff so they can run, play, and grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. The boundaries are a fence to protect, not to destroy their freedom.